Last year, just a few months before Easter, my family told me that we were going to be going camping over Easter weekend. This meant that we would miss Easter morning at church. It meant that we wouldn't get to hear an Easter Sunday sermon. I know, a cardinal sin. After having been to Bible college for a full semester and a half, my parents, of course, asked me to provide an Easter morning sermon. They thought that because I had taken Journey Through the Bible that I was more than qualified to give a full sermon. What's more, they also asked me if I would be willing to baptize my father and my brother and anyone else there who wanted to get baptized. Can I be honest? I was scared. I was frightened because I didn't feel qualified or equipped to do any of those things. I thought to myself, there's no way I could possibly preach an Easter sermon. I thought, how can I be responsible for baptizing someone? How could I be responsible for such an integral part in someone's walk of faith? It just seemed too much for me. Looking back at it now, I understand how I felt because not much has really changed. I still don't feel qualified to do those things. I don't feel qualified to speak in front of an entire congregation. I don't feel qualified to speak in front of a youth group, even though I've done it. I barely feel qualified to stand in front of you all and deliver this sermon. I don't feel qualified to be God's servant. So why did he choose me to serve? I'm certainly not perfect. I can't even count my sins. I can't possibly know all of the times when I should have prayed and I didn't. I can't possibly know how much dust my Bible has gathered. Regardless, God has still chosen me to be his servant, just like how Jesus chose a very unlikely servant. You see, Matthew is this unlikely servant. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapters 9 and 10. So I'll give you a moment to get your Bibles open if you have them. We're going to start reading in verse 9. It starts by saying, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. We see here in the calling of Matthew that Matthew himself is a very unlikely servant. Matthew was a tax collector, and in this day and age, tax collectors were immoral. They were untouchable. Tax collectors were classed together with robbers and murderers. They were seen as lowly. They were known for their greed. Beyond this, there was two categories of tax collectors. The first were the ones that the Jews called the Gabbai. They collected general taxes, which included those on land and other property, those on income, and those referred to as poll or registration taxes. The basic land tax was 1/10 of one's grain and 1/5 of one's fruit and wood. Income tax amounted to about 1% of one's earnings, and the amount of the poll tax varied. The second type of tax collector was called the Maquis, who collected a wide variety of use taxes. The taxes that they collected were similar to our tollway fees, boat docking fees, business license fees, and so on. The Mokies could attach a tax to virtually any article or activity. They could, for instance, tax a person's boat. They could tax the fish that he caught with it, and on the dock where he unloaded it. They could tax a traveler's donkey, his slaves, his servants, and his goods. Going deeper, there was also two different kinds of Mokies. One kind, called the Great Mokies, hired other men to collect the taxes for them. And because of this, they were partially anonymous and were able to protect at least some of their reputation. The other kind, called the Small Mokies, did their own assessing and collecting, and therefore were in constant contact with the members of the community, as well as with all travelers who passed their way. The Gabai were despised. The Great Mokies were more despised, and the Small Mokies were despised the most. Matthew was obviously a Small Mokies because he himself was sitting in the tax office as Jesus passed through the outskirts of Capernaum. He was the most despised of the despicable, and it was to him that Jesus said, "Follow me." Since tax collectors, and specifically Matthew, was a Jew working for the Romans, he was considered a traitor by fellow Jews. But it was Matthew himself that wrote the verse that made it known to the people that he was writing to that he was a tax collector. He openly admits that he was the most despised, vile, and corrupt man in all of Capernaum. As both a Jew and a tax collector, he was viewed as a traitor to his nation and to God because he was willing to collaborate with a pagan foreign conqueror. But Jesus could see Matthew as what he could become. Jesus saw a servant rather than a sinful traitor. But Matthew wasn't just an unlikely servant, he's also an unlikely author. I want to move down to the beginning of chapter 10, where it says, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them the authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. I'm going to focus in on some of the names that were listed here. First of all, Peter. John MacArthur describes Peter as having all of the right experiences. Peter had the right kind of attitude and boldness to be able to lead for the Lord. In a sense, Peter was the right guy. Andrew was a godly and dedicated Jew. James was a fisherman with an incredible zeal and a servant's heart. John was a follower of John the Baptist before he was ever a disciple of Jesus. Philip was already a devout man. Bartholomew was already a student of Scripture. Even Thomas is described as a man of great faith and dedication. But Matthew was a tax collector. Out of all the men that were listed here, only John and Matthew wrote gospel accounts. What's more incredible is who they wrote to. I want to talk about the gospel accounts. First off, the book of Mark. The book of Mark was most likely written to Rome and to the Romans. We know this because Mark contains Latinisms, which are Roman words that have been transliterated into Greek. This suggests that not only was Mark most likely in Rome when he wrote the book, but he also likely wrote the book to the Roman people. It was written to introduce Jesus to the Romans because it explains many Jewish customs to which the Romans would be unfamiliar with. The book of Luke is directly addressed to a man called Theophilus. This man is likely a patron who desired a more complete account of the life of Jesus and of the early church. Moving on to the book of John, we can see that it was most likely written to a pre-existing Christian audience. The Muratorian canon written 180 AD and the Clement of Alexandria that was written in 215 AD both suggest that John wrote this book to the people of Asia Minor. Since John likely wrote the book between 85 and 90 AD, it's reasonable to assume that he wrote the book to Christians. John specifically states his purpose in chapter 20, verse 31, which states, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Therefore, we can see that the purpose of John's gospel is to confirm and secure Christians in their faith. However, unlike all of these other gospels, the book of Matthew is the only one written with heavy Jewish themes. There are 60 references to the Old Testament prophecies and 40 direct quotes from the Old Testament found within the book of Matthew. This indicates that the book of Matthew was written to Jews who knew and understood Old Testament scriptures. Out of all the men that were listed, Matthew was the one who wrote the gospel to the Jews. Out of all the men that were listed, Matthew would be the one who was already despised by the Jews. He was a tax collector. He was a traitor to his nation, so why would Matthew be qualified to write to the people that hated him the most? The answer is because God called him to. Despite Matthew being the most unlikely servant and author to write to the Jews, he was still given the same command as all of the other disciples. We read back in chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Matthew, along with all of the other disciples, is called to be a worker of the harvest. Here, the earthly harvest is a time of the year when all the crops are ripe and ready to be picked. After a year of tending to the earth, nurturing the crops, and waiting, the fruit is finally plentiful. If the crops are not harvested quickly, they will rot and be wasted. During harvests that are plentiful, many workers are needed. Jesus is saying that the harvest of his people for his kingdom is both plentiful and present, but the workers who will collect this harvest are few. There are more harvest opportunities in God's kingdom than there are workers to do the gathering. Not only are the disciples called to be workers of the harvest, but so are we. Jesus wants laborers, people that are accustomed to working in the fields, people that aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. I don't know how many of you are familiar with agriculture, but I spent 3 years in high school as a part of the FFA. If you're unfamiliar, the FFA stands for the Future Farmers of America. Now, clearly, I did not fulfill this as I am not a farmer. But regardless of my lack of Carhartt and tractor driving skills, I learned a lot from my time in the FFA. I was deeply involved. I spent 2 of those years as an officer for my chapter. I went to every state, district, and I even went to national events. I did livestock judging, horticulture, and ag mechanics. But one thing that I can tell you about agriculture is that it never stops. Year round, there is work to be done. Working in the harvest is no different than this. There is always work to be done for the kingdom of God, whether it's planting in the spring or harvesting in the fall. The workers are few, but every church has opportunities. Every church has potential workers. All they need is a push. Notice how Jesus tells his disciples to pray that the Lord will send out harvest workers. The specific word that is used here is ekbale. This word comes from the verb ekbalo, which means to cast out or exercise. You see, Jesus is not saying, ask the Lord of the harvest to find or to recruit workers. Instead, he says, ask the Lord to thrust them out. There are Christian workers in every church. All they need is to have a fire lit under them, to have the living God cast them out of their comfort and into the world of adventure and need, into the work of harvesting in the field of God. I'm sure many of you have heard a similar sermon to this and have dismissed it, saying to yourself that the harvest is obviously a foreign mission, or the harvest is full-time commitment to ministry. But there are other kinds of Christian work for the harvest. For example, teaching, administration, social work, and even medical work are things that can be done for the harvest in any area of life. Do not be like me and say that you are not capable or that you are not qualified. Because just like Matthew, we are all unlikely servants. John Calvin put it well when he said that the calling of us all depends not on the merits of our own righteousness, but on his sheer generosity. I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine named Landon. Landon and I met when I was a sophomore in high school, and we became friends pretty quick. He's been a good friend of mine since then. We were both in FFA together. We took ag classes together. We would go on trips together. And the thing was, I was Landon's only Christian friend. He had no bad experiences with the church, but he didn't really have any good ones either. He would go with his grandma whenever she wanted to, but he would never go by his own volition. Sometimes I would slyly invite him to stay the night Saturday. That way I could force him into coming to church with me on Sunday. I was Landon's Christian friend. I always thought that it was my responsibility to try and pull Landon towards faith. Anytime I would talk with him, he would listen, he would ask good questions, but I never felt like I got anywhere with him. Years later now, he's at Biotech. He's finishing out his degree. He'll be done later this year in September. But throughout his time there, he's been getting involved in Bible study, completely unprompted by me. Every once in a while, Landon will call me, and he'd say, Justin, me and my roommate are reading through this section in John right now, and we're really confused. Can you explain it to us? Or he'll say, we're reading through Matthew, and we think this ties back to Genesis. Is that an accurate assumption to make? Landon would tell me, Justin, you're my Bible knowledge guy. I don't feel qualified to be Landon's Bible knowledge guy. If anyone else came up to me and said, Justin, you're my Bible knowledge guy, I'd say, please, no. Talk to Dr. Williams or talk to Vance Russell, talk to anyone but me. I'm not qualified enough to guide you. I certainly don't have the knowledge to be able to teach someone or to answer questions, but regardless, I've been placed in Landon's life to help guide him. In case you tune me out, I know that I'm the last sermon of the day, but I want you to focus in and I want you to hear this. I know that all of you have been placed in similar positions in your lives. whether it's someone in your personal life, or whether it's a whole congregation, or maybe for many of you, it's students at youth group. Each and every one of you has been placed in someone's life to be there for them. You guys, imposter syndrome is real. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to someone here on campus and they've said, I don't know how I'm the one here right now. I'm surrounded by these giants of faith. I'm surrounded by people that have it all together. I'm surrounded by people that do a Bible study every day. I'm surrounded by prayer warriors. I'm surrounded by people that are amazing, and I'm not. I'm not possibly qualified to serve alongside these people. But to that, I want to ask a question. Who are you to say that God shouldn't use you for the harvest? Who are you to say, I don't pray enough, I don't read my Bible enough, I don't have perfect faith, I don't have a perfect track record, and those things disqualify you from service? Who are you to say that you shouldn't be used by the same God that used Matthew, a tax collector, a man that turned his back on his own people? Who are we to withhold our lives when we have been given grace? Simply, if the call to service for the harvest was based on moral perfection, none of us would ever be qualified. But regardless of how unlikely it is, God has called us his servants.